Hello, everyone. I'm Jessica McDonald, the Nancy Inman and Marlene Nathan Meyerson Curator of Photography at the Harry Ransom Center. I'd like to welcome you to our program, Collecting Conversations, 5 Women in American Photography. Today's conversation will include 5 artists whose work has recently been acquired by the Ransom Center's photography collection: Betty Hahn, Joanne Leonard, Joan Lyons, Bea Nettles, and Susan Ressler. About a year ago, while the Ransom Center's public spaces were closed due to the COVID-19 pandemic, I was invited to develop a series of online programs featuring some of the Ransom Center's recent photography acquisitions and, more generally, addressing our current approach to collecting. Curators at any institution regularly evaluate the collections in our care and consider how they were formed and how they bear the imprint of former collectors, donors, and curators. We look for gaps and imbalances and identify works that might help to fill those gaps. Through this process, we notice what and who is missing. At the Ransom Center, one of those gaps has been photographs by American artists, especially those whose careers began in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. And as is the case with many collecting institutions around the world, one notable subset of that gap has been the work of women, especially women whose work was considered experimental or even groundbreaking when it emerged. Many of the artists we'll hear from today did enjoy some early success with exhibitions at major institutions and even some early acquisitions. Yet, in general, women were less likely than their male peers to be exhibited, to secure gallery representation, or to find publishers for their work in the 1960s and 70s, and thus may not be as well known. Yet today, many institutions are busily and even competitively filling in gaps of their work, suggesting that they are rectifying a significant oversight. This all raises questions about past collecting practices and about how we can account for the current swell of interest. This is what I hope to discuss with our panelists today. Over the last several months, I've conducted a separate long-form interview with each of these artists, and I would encourage everyone to go back and watch those interviews for an extensive look at their careers. Today's panel discussion brings them all together at the culmination of the series. This program is not intended to generalize the artistic practice or the experience of these 5 women, but rather to explore the cultural and institutional conditions that shape our collections. So for the purpose of today's panel discussion, I've asked each of our guests to introduce a single work or specific body of work that the Ransom Center has recently acquired. Following these short presentations, I will invite the artists to answer some of my questions, and they will have the opportunity to ask questions of one another as well. And we're going to start today with Betty Hahn. Betty Hahn is an artist and educator who has been recognized since the 1960s for her mixed media works that challenge the conventions of photography. She taught at the Rochester Institute of Technology from 1969 to 1975 and accepted a position at the University of New Mexico in 1976. There, she taught in the Art and Art History department for 22 years, many of those as chair of the photography program. She retired in 1997 as professor emerita. The monograph Betty Hahn, Photography or Maybe Not, published by the University of New Mexico Press in 1995, remains the most comprehensive volume of her work. Betty joins us from Albuquerque. Welcome, Betty.
Hi, glad to be here. Glad to be here with the other women. Thanks, Jessica.
Glad to have you. The Ransom Center recently acquired your 1972 work, Red Cabbage. What can you tell us about this work?
Red Cabbage, as part of a series I was doing of gum bichromate prints on fabric. And once these gum bichromates were on that fabric surface, I knew immediately the only way to add color was with more fabric or with thread. Thread was the color line, and thread comes in all colors. So the vegetables, basically, and I did I did quite a few vegetables, other things, landscapes, portraits. I was interested in the fact that the gum bichromate could be printed on fabric. And the first 2 or 3 definitely were experimental, but then when I got that to work, I didn't think of them as experiments anymore. I just thought I was proceeding with a series, and I particularly liked the vegetables because vegetables came in colors, mostly green, but I did a few grapefruits and what else? A big lettuce and broccoli. And these things for me were explorations of the color and what I could do with a thread. I didn't want to get too fancy with the thread because that would have been a distraction. So it was basically the shape of the vegetable that was interesting. But fortunately, I was living in Rochester at the time, and this was not considered hopelessly radical. Someone there called it fearlessly decorative, and I went along with that. Certainly the fearlessly part, I like that. But some people, of course, did not welcome this type of work. I had a show in New York, and the photo critic from the New York Times came, was Jake Deschen, and he said to me, "What are these, handkerchiefs?" So there was, I think it was either go or no go on these, but fortunately, I was launched in the 60s by Nathan Lyons at the Eastman House. So I'm pretty secure about this. I don't question why I do things too much. I just go ahead and do them. And what else can I say about these? Say they're a hard sell. Museums do not want to buy these. Private collectors do not want to buy these. These type things, from what I pick up from what people have told me, secondhand information, this is the lunatic fringe. But I'm happy here being the lunatic fringe, always have been.
I think that's a wonderful place to end that introduction, but we're definitely going to pick up on that in our group discussion in a few minutes. Thank you very much for that, Betty. The next artist we'll hear from is Joan Lyons. Joan Lyons is an artist and educator who has worked in a broad range of experimental media over more than 6 decades and has produced over 40 editioned artist books. For nearly 35 years, Joan was on the faculty of the Visual Studies Workshop, an independent artist-run organization with a graduate program in Rochester, New York, and was simultaneously director of the Visual Studies Workshop Press, a leading publisher and printer of artist books. There, she oversaw the production of more than 450 titles and was editor in 1985 of Artist Books, a critical anthology and source book, thought to be the first such in-depth study of the emerging creative form. Joan is joining us from her studio in Rochester. Welcome, Joan.
Hi, Jessica. Nice to see everyone.
Well, thanks for joining us. You are going to talk about your 1976 work, Drawing from the Hip. What can you tell us about this work?
Okay, this is from a series called Women's Portrait Series, and there's something I call Xerox transfer drawings. In 1969, I was introduced to the Haloid Xerox camera and processor, and I was immediately hooked on this flatbed equipment, which was at once a large format camera and a device that could produce drawing-like carbon toner images on rag paper. It was a Xerox machine from the era of pre-automated copy machines. So I soon acquired a machine of my own, and it became, I think for about 10 years, my primary camera and drawing tool. Because as I just started at that time bringing photographic images into my work, which had been painting, drawing, and printmaking, my greatest desire was to make a photographic image on plain paper. And at the time, that wasn't so easy to do. I was frustrated with the limited size of the image until that problem was solved when someone showed me how to transfer images to either large size paper or aluminum plates, which were then printed as lithographs. So this series of drawings, I think I date them from 1972 to 1980, and the size is uniformly 19 by 26. Because these portraits, seemingly monolithic, are composites of many individual images. They also are not traditional photographs, photographic portraits. They're not naturalistic. They're awkward in gesture. The subject is immobile and flattened. The images resemble icons more than snapshots. They're women frozen in their representations. And I thought of them as archetypes rather than portraits. Many of them I related to historical representations of women. Relevant reading, what I was involved in reading at the time, was Eric Neumann's The Great Mother, some Freud, Jung, and some mythology. Because through an investigation of the cultural feminine and female archetypes, I thought I might learn something about historical images of women through representations made by a woman. And these at the time felt like there wasn't much precedent for this kind of work, and I'm not quite sure how I wandered into it. But I knew that I had some need to understand and materialize aspects of representations of women from a woman's point of view. So I used myself, friends, and family members. And at the time I began this work in the early 70s, I would have been really unable to articulate ideas about feminism, nor was I aware of many other women making work with which to begin a redefinition of gender, although there were many. And I did know, of course, the work of Bea and Betty, who were here in Rochester. The piece that Jessica has was one of the last images in the series, and one of the few pieces in which the woman is allowed some mobility and agency. And I think maybe it was done after I had doing this work for about 10 years, and I think it took me 10 years to arrive at this point where I could free myself and the image from some of the boxes that women had been put into.
Okay, great. Thank you for that very thorough introduction. Wonderful. We're going to hear from Bea Nettles next. Bea Nettles is an artist and educator who has been exhibiting and publishing her autobiographical works since 1970. She is Professor Emerita at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, where she established the undergraduate program in photography in 1984 and was chair until 1999 before retiring in 2008. The major retrospective exhibition, Bea Nettles, Harvest of Memory, was presented at the Sheldon Art Gallery in St. Louis, the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, and the Krannert Art Museum at the University of Illinois from 2019 until it just closed just weeks ago in 2021. The exhibition was accompanied by a catalog of the same name, co-published by the George Eastman Museum and the University of Texas Press. Welcome, Bea.
Thanks. It's really fun to be here. And it's also fun that the first three people have talked about Rochester, which is where I was in the 70s. That was my first teaching job. So it was an amazing place for us to be. I'm going to talk about three pieces that appeared in Flamingo in the Dark, a self-published monograph book that I did of my work in what was called, still is called, quick print, although I think museums prefer to call it gum bichromate. But it was a commercial gum process method that I first saw in a show in 1970, and I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't figure out what it was. And it was a guy, he had done this work, and he didn't give out any information as to what it was. He said something about it being a gum print on plastic, and I thought he was a genius to be able to get it to stick to plastic. But it was a few years later that Eileen Cowan came through town, and she had worked a little bit in quick print. She flipped it over, showed me a label, said, "You can buy this, Bea. It's in Brooklyn, and here's how you do it." So she shared with me something technical, which I thought, well, I'm not so sure I want to use this, because she was mainly doing pink and blue, and I wasn't sure about it, but I'll teach it. I'll get some and I'll teach it. So I explored how to use it, and it really suited me because my background was in painting. I always wanted to mix color, work in a very painterly method in layers, because I had a lot of printmaking experience too. And again, we've said before, Joan said this, it was really difficult to do, Betty also mentioned it, to do anything in color, especially on an unusual surface. So this was perfect. I could mix my own colors, put things in layers and so forth. So technically, it became my medium of choice quite a bit during the 70s. I did at least 100 or so individual one-of-a-kind prints using quick print. Okay, so when it comes to the content of the three prints, they all are self-portraits to one degree or another. They deal with me as a female, because that's what I know best, and also archetypes and symbols. I'm like Joan, I was reading a fair amount at that point in time about symbolism, and it enters your work whether you read about it or not. At least that's the way it does with me. So the first image is Green River Dream, and I'm laid out sort of dreaming behind another piece of mine, which was a mirrored surface, a river, a full-length river image. And I do that a lot. I recycle my own art in other art. Things keep turning up. So that first one was before I had children. And it's a self-portrait, basically as woman as water. Also could look a bit like Ophelia if you want to look at it that way. The second one is, let's see, what did I call it? COs. And it's got a picture of me nude, two pictures of me, one young and with my regular body, and the other is a pregnant female. And that was pretty radical for me. First of all, I don't photograph myself nude very often. And then to have photographed my belly in a fairly obvious way, I was quite pregnant, was reasonably unusual at that point, but it seemed important. Again, it's sort of a Mother Earth image and a comparison of the two states of my life, pre-children and on the way to having children. And then the third one is called R in the Pines, or Rachel in the Pines, and it's a portrait taken very early after Rachel was born, and I'm holding her in my lap. And it was Olivia Las Gonzalez who curated the show and was a co-author of the book, my retrospective book, who pointed out that it's the hidden mother as well. I would not have even thought about that. But if you look at that image in light of Victorian portraits where the mother would be holding the baby, but sort of disguised or draped in some way just to hold the baby, it is a lot like that. I certainly wasn't aware of that. I was basically focusing on her because that's what became my focus for quite a few years. Still is. Once you're a mother, you're always a mother. I had a son a few years later, and he began to enter my work as well. So that's 3 pieces from Flamingo in the Dark, which is a visual autobiography done in color of the time.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. That gives us plenty to talk about in a little bit. Okay. Susan Ressler is next. Susan Ressler is an artist and educator who's been making photographs since the early 1970s. She's professor emerita in the Department of Visual and Performing Arts at Purdue University, where she taught photographic practice, criticism, and history from 1981 to 2004. Susan edited the scholarly anthology Women Artists of the American West, published in 2003, and the first book of her own photographs, Executive Order, Images of 1970s Corporate America, was published by Daylight Books in 2018. And Susan is joining us from her home in Taos, New Mexico. Welcome, Susan.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here. And it's really a treat to see Betty Hahn, who was one of my professors at the time when I was in grad school at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque back in the 70s, which is actually where I started the work that I want to talk about today, that Jessica acquired for the collection at the Harry Ransom Center. When I first came to the University of New Mexico, the one body of work that I had done had been done in Canada on a First Nations reserve amidst a group of Algonquian Indian folks who were very disadvantaged. And the work sat for a long time, and because I began to think about the issues involved in documentary photography and the power relationships, because often the photographer is in a position of privilege, and here I was photographing these disadvantaged people. So when I came to New Mexico, at first I photographed cattle auctions. I think Betty remembers that work. And then I had sort of an epiphany in thinking about this, and I wanted to shift my lens. Instead of looking at the local color, I wanted to look at affluence in America. So I started to go into banks in Albuquerque. And this early work was called American Business Interiors. And then it led me to go to Los Angeles, where I joined a group of photographers who were doing an NEA survey of Los Angeles for the bicentennial, and that was called the Los Angeles Documentary Project. And that's really where this early work I'd been doing at UNM came to fruition as part of this survey run by John Humble. And it's where I did a portfolio called the Capital Group, 15 prints, each artist for the Los Angeles Documentary Project, which, by the way, took place in 1979 through 1980. And so my work was about corporate America, and there was no better place to do it than in Los Angeles, where there were a lot of Fortune 500 companies from the tech sector, the financial sector. In fact, what you see behind me is one of the photographs from that series I like to put myself in there so that I can be a female executive, I guess. But you know, as Jessica pointed out to me, when I did the Los Angeles documentary project work, which eventually led to the book that she mentioned, Executive Order, which was not published until 2018, but this work was in the late 70s. It turns out I was the only woman on that project. The other photographers were really pretty well known: Robert Flick, Joe Deal, Bill Owens, Max Yavno, and a few other people. But back then, I didn't really think of myself as a woman photographer. I wasn't aware of the racial and feminist issues that are embodied in this work simply because of the time period when almost all of the executives, everyone I photographed, was male and white. And it was just the way things were, so much so that it seemed normalized to me. But of course, you know, I have a different awareness of it now. And so that's, I think, a good introduction to the work. Thank you again.
Thank you for that. That was a really good introduction, and you're right, we will pick up on a number of those issues in just a few minutes. Okay, our final artist to introduce today is Joanne Leonard. Joanne Leonard is a photographer, photo collage artist, educator, and writer whose work has contributed to a range of fields, from fine art to autobiography studies. After teaching in the San Francisco Bay Area in the 1960s and 70s, she taught at the University of Michigan for 31 years and is now Distinguished Professor Emerita in the School of Art and Design and the Department of Women's Studies. Her monograph, Being in Pictures, an Intimate Photo Memoir, was published by the University of Michigan Press in 2008. And she joins us today from her home in Ann Arbor. Welcome, Joanne.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much. How interesting to hear each of you. Susan's presentation did a good jumping off place for me, because the project that I chose a photograph from was also part of the photo surveys series of National Endowment for the Arts grants. And I worked with Bill Owens and Chauncey Hare, and was chosen to represent a women's perspective because they noticed that was missing. There was one other photographer whose work I really never saw that much, and his name I don't remember. The photograph I chose, my part of the project, it concentrated on domestic spaces, which is a bit odd since that's not really where I'm most comfortable, but it was what I could manage because my daughter was 2 years old and I knew I couldn't pick a subject where I had to make a lot of appointments and go and be somewhere else. So I took the photographs of all the houses in the block where I lived and concentrated on home technology, which was TVs and blenders and stoves and refrigerators and even running water and so on. So the photograph that I thought I would talk about is of a kitchen counter, and on it is a Corningware coffee pot, a couple of electric can openers, one that appears to work and one that doesn't, has the cord wrapped all around it, and a radio. So that's quite a lot of and a night light all plugged in next to each other on a kitchen counter. It actually happens to be my parents' kitchen. So that is a little touch of the autobiographic that crept in sometimes, because after I did the work in California, I moved to Ann Arbor to take my position at the university there, and then continued the project in various locations. And eventually, the exhibit that was prearranged as we got the grant fell apart because Chauncey Hare wanted a lot of text on the wall and wanted it to be very critical of corporate America, even of some of the corporations that sponsored the San Francisco Museum of Art. So they canceled the show. And ultimately, I think I colluded in the obscurity of this work because I didn't know that it was particularly interesting. And I think as things go out of fashion in styles of clothing, same thing with kitchens, they get a little more interesting to look at, these appliances and so on, as the years have gone by. So now they've been collected. The Museum of Modern Art has some, and quite a few other museums, and Jessica's collection at the Ransom. But originally, to make them a little more interesting, to me, I began to look at them as almost like landscape horizons and to draw on the photographs. So that took me, as often my work became my photographs became the basis for photo collage work. I think that's probably enough, Jessica, do you think? Yeah.
Great. Well, we can talk a lot about more as we move on. That was a really wonderful introduction, all of you. And again, I just want to remind anybody watching this that we have extensive interviews with each of you where we get to touch on all kinds of different bodies of work and show much more of your careers. But for today, we just wanted to kind of introduce a specific work or body of work. Wonderful. Okay, well, thanks again to each of you for telling us about those works and for giving us a great deal of context for the next part of our discussion. I have a number of questions for you, and I'd like to begin by asking about your early experiences with museums and galleries. In our individual interviews that we've been working on over the last year, many of you talked about the challenges you faced when presenting your work to museum curators and galleries in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s. I've asked Joanne and Susan to share their experiences and to tell us about what they think may have contributed to those challenges. Joanne, would you start us off?
I'm afraid that I forgot this segment would be where I would address problems with exhibiting, and I mentioned it already. The other most significant time that I had conflict or problems with establishment was with the Journal of a Miscarriage, where in some realms, particularly with women audiences, people were amazed, grateful, impressed. Lucy Lepard was very a feminist critic, very interested, but that when I took it with such encouragement, took it to the Museum of Modern Art, the curators there were appalled, it would be easy to say. So that was another moment where I ran into resistance and was very discouraged. And that work I really never was published until 2008. A few small publications with a selected number in black and white, but in the volume you mentioned, my book with the University of Michigan in 2008, then it's kind of the center of the book.
Well, and you've mentioned to me that the difficulty with speaking with institutions about your Journal of a Miscarriage had something to do, you felt, with certain subjects that seemed to be off limits or not taken seriously as sort of capital A art. And you felt those subjects included things like miscarriage, but also even included things like the domestic spaces of women. So the photographs that we've collected that you've spoken about were also considered just not subjects that would be taken seriously. Would you like to add just a couple sentences about that work?
Yeah, I think in the case of the Miscarriage Journal, the resistance was definitely theirs. I was happy with the work, and a lot of the responses where people had been responsive really impelled me to think that it was important enough to take to a museum. But I was either met with, oh my God, this is disgusting, or very measured and calm, I think this is something we all know about, don't we? Closing the portfolio and not wanting to look at it more. So I felt that it was too hard for me to be present when somebody reviewed this work, and I felt that I was being judged. So I put it aside. But I think in the case of the interiors, it was somewhat my buying into the idea that my world wasn't, that I really valued, wasn't a domestic world either. I hoped for a place somewhere outside the home for recognition and so on. So the combination of the general resistance and my own willingness to accept that attitude doubled or duplicated the resistance to that work.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. Susan, let's hear what your experience was.
Well, I did not encounter a lot of resistance to showing my work, particularly the corporate work from the Los Angeles Documentary Project. And I think part of that was because when this whole project was finished, there were 2 exhibitions plus an international publication that accompanied the release of the work in 1981. One of those was in Los Angeles at, I believe, Mount St. Mary's College in LA, and the other one was at Grossmont Junior College in San Diego. And then a selection of all of the photographers' works was published in Camera magazine in 1981, which is a Swiss magazine, and the entire issue was devoted to the project. Then later on, there used to be a museum called, I believe, the Photography Museum in LA, and it was the repository for the work, which was eventually moved to the Smithsonian Art Museum, American Art Museum at the Smithsonian. So this work was collected and exhibited right away. As far as me getting my work into other institutions, that didn't happen for a very long time. And it may have also been because I was a professor at Purdue. I was really focused on teaching. And I was also focused on exhibiting because I knew if I didn't get a lot of exhibitions, I wouldn't be promoted. And so that was my focus. And I actually decided to look back at an old resume I have to find out, like, well, what was I doing in the 70s as far as exhibiting? And I realized that this work was actually exhibited quite a number of places. In the mid 80s, it was in a number of group shows, like, at the Light Factory, at New Mexico State University, at the Houston Center for Photography. So it was more, I just didn't focus on getting my work into collections until a lot later, but I did not encounter problems exhibiting.
Thank you for that. And I think that's consistent with what I've observed from the conversations I had with each of you, is that even though there may have been a proliferation of opportunities to exhibit, that didn't necessarily parlay itself into acquisitions by major institutions. And there seemed to be some disconnect there for a variety of reasons. And for each of you, they may have been a bit different, but decades later, those works, however frequently exhibited, were not in a large number of public collections. And I think that's a really nice segue to the next question I'd like to move to. Essentially, the way I've framed this question is very, very much connected to some of the things you've just said. So in addition to being acquired with less frequency than that of your male peers in the 60s or 70s, and this is all of you, the work you made was generally less likely to be exhibited in group shows or major institutional surveys of contemporary photography. And now I say less likely. Now all of you have lists of exhibitions from the 70s and 80s, but I think on balance, it was a bit tougher. And I think everybody on this panel and many watching can pick up catalogs of group exhibitions in the 60s and 70s and find that there might be a handful of women in the group of 100 photographers or so. So then in the 1970s and 80s, perhaps to acknowledge this imbalance, there was a swell of exhibitions and editorial projects that featured only works by women. And that's a practice that continues today, and we should openly acknowledge that we're doing it right now for good reason, I think, and that's something that you will have something to say about. But if we go back to the 1970s, even then, some women enthusiastically embraced those opportunities, while others declined to participate in women's only projects, concerned about reinforcing the idea that photography by women somehow constituted a marginal category standing somewhere outside the mainstream. And I've asked both Joan and Betty to share their experiences making work that was perceived as outside the mainstream, and to talk about how they felt about participating in projects that exclusively featured women. Joan, why don't you start us off here?
Okay, in view of the conversation we've been having, some really new kinds of ideas about this have arisen. So, I'll try and articulate some of it. It's a complex question, but back in the day, I was kind of resistant to being included in women-only shows. And because this seemed at the time to be an exclusionary practice, and my tendency was to decline. But it probably did depend on who was doing the organizing, because I noted that I did participate in a Women of Photography show at SF MoMA in 1975. And that was maybe the only, women-only show in the 60s and 70s. But my attitudes must have softened along with recent trends in the art world and photo worlds. I'm supportive, of a women's museum and collections of feminist art, because I feel that those important trends deserve a place. They deserve the historical place, which they were denied for a long time. So, I've just sent off some work to be included in an exhibition of early women artist bookmakers. And I don't know, it probably helps that it's curated by a friend who I know will do a responsible and good job. And I'm honored to be part of this project of Jessica's, which she conceived to provide a bit of balance to a collections policy that's heavily weighted toward men. Also, it's interesting. I mean, Susan's work, her corporate work was readily accepted. So a lot of the concern about women's work, I think, in the 60s and 70s had to do that we were using inappropriate subject matter, that we were letting personal issues make their way into our work, that we were interested in decorative arts, we were interested in needlework, we were interested in fabrics, we were interested in things that were, excluded from, the major art world, and fixed subject matter for art making was defined, and we weren't falling into the definition.
Thank you. I'll just add that I heard you say something once in another interview about this idea of the mainstream, and I hope I am paraphrasing sufficiently, but you said something like, what's more ordinary and mainstream but the lives of women? Why should that be outside the mainstream? And that has stuck with me and seems relevant to this conversation as well. I'd like to give Betty a chance to answer the same question about inclusion or willingness or enthusiasm for participating in women's only shows, and if that was something you experienced, and how did you feel about that then?
I was initially kind of thrilled that women were organizing shows with just other women. That was my initial response in the early 70s. And they wanted my stitched work. Once they saw the stitched work, that's what they wanted from in the early 70s, because it was, they assumed feminist. I assumed feminine. I was not politically motivated because I was just too dumb and too oppressed, I think, coming from my Catholic education. And it took me a while to catch up. Now I can look back and go, what were you thinking? What were you not thinking? Some of these first shows were done by women feminists in women's studies, and they were not professional photo handlers. So I would loan them my work and it would be returned damaged. 16 by 20 inch mounted fabric mounted on cardboard. I had several of those returned to me in an envelope with the corners ruined. So after that, I really was more interested in who the handlers were and also who the people were. And I remember Ann Noggle and Marjorie Mann working on women in photography. So I had confidence in them. I was never insulted that these were just women photographers, for the simple reason I was glad to see the work of women, because how else would I see it? I felt really kind of isolated. Living in Rochester, though, made such a big difference for me because of the Eastman House. I was in an exhibit there the year I finished graduate school. But this is all thanks to Nathan Lyons, who did shows that were, get this, counting, seen photographically, group show, and then another one, Vision and Expression. So these were group shows that I was included in, and I was thrilled to be there, really. And of course, I was slow to realize that once I got out of Rochester, there was a whole big world of museums, exhibitions, collections. And while I was invited to be in a lot of group exhibitions, always showing my work, never buying my work. When it came to buying, they always went toward men, or they went to Diane Arbus or Julia Margaret Cameron. Then we have our woman. We have our marginalized figure.
I'm glad you brought that up. And that leads very, very nicely into the next thing I'd like to talk about. In the interview series, in the interviews I've conducted with all of you, several of you noted that a particular obstacle you faced when approaching museums or galleries for exhibitions, and particularly for acquisitions, and that's what we're talking about today principally, is that your work combined media, and so contemporary art galleries or contemporary art departments said it was too photographic and said you should really go talk to a photography gallery, or you should go to the photography department. And then you went there, you made an appointment or sort of showed up, and those departments or those galleries said, well, this really isn't photography. This is not really photographic or not photographic enough or not purely photographic. So maybe you should go talk to, a contemporary art gallery or a gallery that deals in prints. And so today I've asked Betty and Joan to tell us about their experiences with this, but several of you have had similar experiences. Betty, what can you tell us about that?
I never did that, made appointments at galleries to show them my work. First of all, I could pretty much assume what they were going to say when they saw it by looking at who they showed. And also by checking with my friends, do you know this person? Do you know what kind of work they like? So I never did that. First of all, I don't think I would like doing that, but I had no time to do that. It's time consuming, and I was teaching full time. I noticed that everybody here is a professor emerita. Everybody was teaching full time, but it wasn't just being a woman, it was being a mixed media person. So I could be excluded from any exhibition for those two reasons. And I, frequently heard afterwards, well, that's not photography, or they have all these dismissive kinds of adjectives to throw at your work and you. And if you do a number of different processes, and my theory about that was the right tool for the right job. If I got an idea, I certainly was familiar with a lot of ways to do it. So it was a conscious choice of process.
Joan, what was your experience?
In talking about pigeonholing, and this is part of what I was saying about women's work and other kinds of media, I've been pigeonholed in many ways. So I wasn't either fond of being pigeonholed and segregated by media. I've been called a Xerox artist. That was one particular definition that followed me around, that chased me around. Offset artist was another, book artist, feminist artist. And I guess these labels were valid for parts of what I was doing because I worked around the periphery of photography and print and with a lot of media. So my work was certainly, all of our work was certainly outside the mainstream, what was considered mainstream at the time. I mean, things were siloed, and I only, as Betty, I never took work around, except I did it once because I was really curious. So I did this once in the early 70s and got just that, just that bizarre response. This is photography, this isn't photography, this is this isn't this, which really never bothered me. I mean, I knew what I was doing. I was working with what there was around me, and there was a lot of wonderful stuff around me because I had a print shop and I had photography equipment, and I could pick up anything I wanted and make work with it. And depending on what it was I wanted to say, there was a material that was right for it. So, so this really wasn't really much of an issue. But there's another really funny story. In the summer of 1980, Bonnie Gordon, John Wood, Doug Boz, and I had a show at Light Gallery. This was like a summer show when things were slow. And I think it was maybe the New York Times critic or one of the photo magazines, just outraged. And I wish I had a copy of this review, but I don't. But the gist of it was, and this was a quote, "What right do these people have calling themselves photographers?"
I think that that's very illustrative of the challenges many people had. Right. That's really interesting.
So,
well, and I'm glad you're leaving off with a bit of press coverage or a review, because that really nicely leads us to the next thing I'd really like to talk about. I'm really interested in the level and character of press coverage that all of your work received when it was exhibited early on, in the ways that reviewers engaged with your work and in the potential impact of those exhibition reviews on your chances for further shows and especially for acquisitions. And if we go beyond reviews and look at who was writing about your work more generally, I think it's significant, and this pertains to some of you more than others, but I think it's significant that for some of you, your work was more likely to be reproduced and discussed in feminist magazines or journals than in the sort of mainstream photography journals. And perhaps that made it less visible to photography curators then, and to historians in subsequent decades who turned to those photography journals for research. I've asked Bea and Joanne to tell us about reviews of their work or publications of their work early in their careers. And Bea, if you could start, your work was reviewed in some high-profile publications in the very early 1970s and through the 70s. So perhaps you could start off by telling us how your work was addressed in those reviews and in other publications that you feel were significant at the time.
Okay, I'll start, and I'm just concentrating on the 70s. I think that's what you wanted me to do. And I was very fortunate because I had some New York shows. I had a lot of exposure really young, and I thought I had it made. There were very few reviewers other than in the New York Times, and that alternated between A.D. Coleman and Jean Thornton on Sunday mornings, and everyone would look at those reviews. And then those were timely. Sometimes the Village Voice also came out with something. They would be up while the show was up. And then if you waited long enough, I had reviews in Art in America and also Art News, but those were after the show was long gone. The one thing I noticed that would happen, if you got a bad review, people quit going to your show. I mean, you think New York is so sophisticated, but it actually really affected turnout. And so you kind of dreaded it. I had to go back and reread these things because it's interesting how the mind works. And you remember, at least I remember, some of the negative things that were said, and I forget all the good stuff. And I had a lot of good stuff said, a lot of support, a lot of reviews, a lot of reproductions and so forth. But it's those little snarky remarks like dream on and that kind of stuff, because a lot of my early work dealt with surrealist sort of dream imagery at that point in time. So I like to think of it as these little cartoon characters, the devil and the angel on your shoulder, and the devil kept saying things in my head, and I had to kind of knock it off and try to think about the angel when I go back in the studio. Not only did negative reviews affect attendance, they did affect sales. And frankly, the only time I sold work would be in New York shows during that decade. Very few gallery placements. A few things happened when people, like institutional sales, but not a lot. And let me see what else. There were a few women that wrote about photography in those days. And one of my worst reviews was by a woman in the Village Voice. And it was a pretty consistently bad review throughout. And it was very upsetting. Forget which show, I think it was my second New York show, until I got on an airplane later and I read this article about pasta. It was the same writer. You know, she was just a freelance writer who didn't know that much about photography. And so this is her opinion in the Village Voice, you know, for everyone to see. So I don't think that review held up too well, but it sure hurt when it happened.
Joanne, I'd love it if you could sort of pick it up from there. You're someone in particular whose work was published in a number of feminist magazines. So maybe tell us about how your work came to be included in those publications.
Well, if I can start with I'm so glad people mentioned Marjorie Mann and Ann Noggle and the show Women of Photography, because that meant the world to me, being included in that. And the very work, romanticism is ultimately fatal, the image that, which is a collage, photo collage, was one that a curator at the San Francisco Museum had said he didn't understand why such a good photographer would be doing all those things to her photographs when I first started making collage. I thought it might be fun to mention that an article in the Oakland Tribune one time about my photography of Oakland said that I was elfin and I was peeking into other people's lives, which just was cringeworthy because it was made me sound so diminutive and dismissive and all. But the attention of curators like Marjorie Mann and Noggle was really crucial for me. And then Lucy Lippard, who's written a couple of essays for catalog essays, and who was one of the people behind the journal Heresies. And Heresies published some of my work a couple of times. And I think other people have articulated well that the feminist context, and then some pretty sophisticated language that came with it, and grew to engage with intellectual pursuits of French feminist scholars and cultural theorists. It gave a kind of, I mean, some of that can be so obscurely written that it's almost like, what did that they're saying that about me? That's just amazing, because that would be not how I could have phrased it at all. But it elevated things in a certain way that even now it would be great to cut out some of that language. It got to be its own way of being excluding, more accessible people who would hope for more accessibility in reading. But I think it was very important. The journals that, as you mentioned, the feminist writing, the ability to theorize the position, and not just cultural feminism or nature and women, equating nature and women, but creating a perspective that has a real intellectual weight to it. It's been very, very important to me. And I think because of the Women of Photography exhibit, I've almost always been excited about that context. It was a wonderful show to be part of. It traveled. It brought together work I didn't know and made me feel connected to people. And so there got to be, for me, an idea that this was an important realm and a terrific realm. And I didn't feel diminished by it in any way. I felt elevated by it.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that these conversations I've had with all of you certainly have made me rethink how I survey the scene. If I want to know what was happening in the 60s and 70s, there's a certain kind of research that I know how to do, but I hadn't done broad surveys of what was reproduced in Ms. Magazine, as you were, Joanne, or in Heresies, or these publications that might not seem to be, again, that word mainstream sort of photo publications that essentially were perhaps exclusionary at the time, then perpetuate a lack of understanding about all the different places that your work was reproduced, and might perpetuate that exclusion ultimately. So I think that's.
Could I just mention?
Yes.
My work right now is in an exhibit at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art, and a review spoke of the museum reaching into a trove of female photographers. It's not an all-women's show, but some of the language in that review really reminded me of how that can sound. That sounds like, oh yeah, they just have a bunch of them, so they had to reach in there. I mean, it wasn't. It's rather disturbing, even though it was terrific to be included in the review, because my work was just in Boston Museum of Fine Arts and not mentioned in the review. So one has really mixed feelings about this being included, and then what's said. Those are different categories.
Well, what you've just brought up, Joanne, is perfect as a sort of segue to the last question I'd like to ask to some of you to wrap up this sort of roundtable portion of this program. In one way or another, each of you has experienced a spike in attention to your work very recently, though none of you was intentionally hiding. Some of you have been quote unquote rediscovered in just the last few years, which Joanne, you said, you talked about mixed feelings. I'm sure some of you have those about that. And some of you have worked strategically to reintroduce your work and have done that successfully. I'm interested in your particular experiences, why you think this is happening now, and what that says perhaps about the past institutional conditions. I'm also wondering if you've observed your male peers being rediscovered or having to strategically reintroduce their work with as much frequency. I've asked Susan and Bea to share their experiences. So Susan, start us off with that.
Well, it's a very interesting question because in my work, for many things that I've done, it's taken me a long time to look back at the work and see new relevance and importance in it that I didn't recognize at the time. But and that probably happened with the publication of my book, Executive Order, of my 1970s corporate America photographs. But I've also given a little thought about how that came about. And it was through a process of going to these reviews that take place in various cities. You know, for example, I don't think my work would have been acquired by the Harry Ransom Center if I'd not gone to PhotoFest at the beginning of the pandemic. So there's a lot of challenges, I think, today in the way things are changing, the way work is seen, the way we're able or not able to get together and interact and dialogue with each other and network. It's all so different. Now, when my work was so-called discovered, it was by Michael Itkoff at Daylight Magazine and at Daylight Books, rather. And I went to the Medium Festival in San Diego, and I wanted to talk to him about publishing my work. But I thought, you know, because I thought it'd be great at that point in my career, 2018, you know, fully mature artist who had been out there for a long time. I thought it would be great to publish a monograph of my more recent work, but he wasn't interested in my recent work. And I've had difficulties getting my more recent work out there because I showed him a broad variety of things, and he immediately gravitated to the 1970s work. And that work has had a lot of play. Also, you know, I have representation by Joseph Bellows and his gallery, but he is only interested in 1970s work. And suddenly it hit me, oh my goodness, I'm vintage. You know, am I that old already? And it was kind of a shock to me to see this word vintage applied to my work. So when Executive Order came out, it was reviewed by the New York Times, it was reviewed by the Financial Times, it was reviewed by Esquire. You know, it got a lot of press, but what I'm doing now, you know, I want to work on a retrospective book, and there's so much interest in my 70s work. What about now? So it's a big question.
Well, and the comment you said about being vintage, which created big smiles all around on our panelists. I think another way to say that might be that from the perspective of institutions, enough time has passed that maybe your work can be historicized in some way. It can be placed within the context of everything that was happening at the time that they know of, and that might be, it might be appealing to bring in that work now that it can be sort of understood along in that whole body of work that came to be in that time. It's no longer contemporary and maybe untested, and we can talk about the necessity of that. You know, that's sort of problematic in itself too, but I think that it's interesting to think about the necessity perhaps of time passing for some artists, but for other artists, institutions seem to be willing to take that risk right off the bat. Bea, what was your experience? What has been your experience as of late? Why don't you tell us?
Okay, I've had this retrospective that traveled, and it was a few years actually in the planning, and then a couple of years in the hanging, and it's finally all of it come back. So I could talk about that a lot, but I did laugh about the 70s comment, because that is actually the main work of mine that's selling. And it's almost gone. So get it while you can. I mean, that's amazing to me, that it's finally happening. But that's, 50 years ago. So we are getting vintage. There's no doubt about it. I've continued to work all that time, and I'm still working on things. What's always been, I've always been doing books as well, and I've done more and more books. Actually, the last 10 years of my career, probably I shifted more to artist books and books than anything else, especially once things went digital. Most people know my work through books. That's been an interesting thing with this retrospective, which was major. There was a lot of work of the whole 50 years. It was fantastic if people could see it. Just in conclusion, though, what was interesting to me would be people would come up and they'd say, I love your work. I've always loved your work. And I would say, great, when have you seen my work? Where did you see my work? And they get this sort of blank look, and they realize they'd never seen my work. They'd never really seen the work, the actual work. They'd seen it in reproduction. And I mean, fortunately, they were aware of it some way, but this show gave people the opportunity to actually see the surface quality, the scale, all of that. And I'm very grateful for that.
Well, you mentioned that your 70s work has been of great interest to institutions and is selling out. And when you said get it while you can, I wanted to say we did. That's what that was something I was very aware of too. Do you attribute that to just this retrospective, or are there some other factors going on maybe in the field in the last decade that might have contributed?
I think one of the main changes in what's being seen and collected is the new generation of curators. I hesitate to say women because there's just a lot more openness to different ways of working. And I do credit education and also the internet. We've got a bit more of an international perspective going as well.
Right. Okay, that's a really interesting perspective. Great. Thanks, all of you. I'm aware those were complicated questions, and I'm really happy that you gave complicated answers. You've all had different experiences, and it's been good and bad, and it's been different for everyone. And I think that that's important for us to realize, and for everyone wanting to realize. What I would like to do before we wrap up today is just to give each of you a chance to ask another one of you a question. And I think we're going to start with Bea. Bea, who would you like to ask a question? Who's your question for?
It's for Betty.
Okay,
For Betty. So I
Go ahead.
start now. Okay. First of all, Betty, I want to thank you for being my mentor at RIT. Betty and I shared an office. I had never had a female teacher, a studio teacher, in my whole career as an undergrad grad student. So here I come, and there's Betty Hahn, and she showed me the ropes and welcomed me to town, and I really do appreciate it. Joan also was wonderful to find a person like that right there in Rochester. It was a really good scene. So my question for Betty, though, is, did you have a mentor?
I had no female teachers all the way through undergraduate and graduate school. My mentor was my photo teacher from Indiana, Henry Holmes Smith. So he was a mentor, but only in specific ways. As far as showing and having your work purchased or whatnot, he never did that. He never encouraged that. He really had nothing to say about that. So all I can think was that when I landed in Rochester, I took Nathan Lyons' workshop, and I got to know the people there, Roger Merton, and of course, Joan Lyons, and different people at the Eastman House. They were the ones that showed my work and bought my work. So this is 60s, mid 60s. You and Joan have no idea how important you were to me, because I wasn't used to women artists working and doing what I was doing. So that was really important. That was the mentor. And because I experienced so many odd things, and like other women, I am prone to remember the little nasty things, but all of those little nasty things, I realized that those reviews and those comments, they tell you more about the person saying them than they do about the work. They almost never talk about the work, never. And there's no way we can make our work safe for these people. We just can't. It's always going to be kind of dangerous, and they're always going to look away or run away. And that's just it. But, in some of these things, I remember being in a printmaking class, and one of the teacher's favorite students, when a guy said, "Those woodcuts are corny." And I went, "Yeah, snapshots, they are corny." And I can say at many points like that, I knew I was right. I was just plain right. Nobody was going to derail me from that.
Mhm.
But anyway, thanks for saying that.
Sure.
Thanks, Bea, for your question. And Betty, this means you're next in asking somebody a question. Who is your question for?
It's for Joan. And I have a couple of things to say. One, that prom dress piece, I just love that. I loved it the first time I saw it. And then she has other pieces that are not her major work, but they do have to deal with fabrics. And I'm bringing those up just because you wanted to talk about my fabric work. I am, totally blown away by her work, and I have been for years. But those fabric things, I'm just wondering, Joan, how did you get the color on that prom dress?
Well, those were, first of all, there are no halftone screens, so the tonal quality comes totally from the mesh of the fabric. That's one thing. And then I just got the color by printing on my hand offset lithopress and sticking down colors. It wasn't color separation. It was just
It was hand
working
introduced.
more like a printmaker. Yeah.
Yeah, it was color introduced by hand.
Well, by printing.
Yeah, right.
You know, Betty, I'd also like to correct because, you know, I was incredibly influenced by you and by Bea in the 60s. I was not doing any photographic work through the 60s. I was painting and, you know, doing painting and drawing, you know, and doing a little bit of printmaking. And I think it was just this incessant influence of photography in Rochester in the 60s. So by the end of the 60s, it just became, you know, unavoidable and irresistible. And I found myself bringing photographic ideas and photographic images into the work that I was already doing.
Yeah, and you knew exactly what to do with them
No
because,
photographic background.
right, in those silk screens you were doing,
Yeah.
those were groundbreaking. I mean,
Fun.
in that period, the 60s, early 70s,
Yeah, right.
you were just brilliant. And as far as I thought, pretty much unrecognized out there in the big world. But the small world was fun, wasn't it?
Well, I was very careful because of Nathan's position to not to keep my work under the table. Kind of, I didn't want anyone to think that I was using, you know, nepotism, my husband's position, to bring myself forward.
Yeah, and yet he supported me so much. He really launched me.
He was
Should
incredibly
have been yours.
people.
Should have been your launching.
No. Well, I know this is, I mean, you people are all admirable and it's amazing.
Well, and we should say, just since we haven't established it yet, and we might have some people watching this who are much younger than us and haven't quite delved into the entire Rochester scene, but Betty, you've brought up the curator, Nathan Lyons, who was at Eastman House in the 60s a number of times. And we haven't yet established that that was Joan's husband, Joan Lyons's husband. So that's what that connection is there. And that's why Joan, beyond just the fact of being in Rochester, but just the fact of being in her own home, was constantly inundated with all things photo and photographers in her home. So that makes sense. Thank you for that question.
That's where it all happened.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of things happened in that house and certainly in that town. And I'm enjoying all the connections that are coming out in these questions. Joan, that means we're to you. Who is your question for?
My question is for Joanne. I'm just interested in knowing what your influence, did you have any actual influences for that early work you did, the early interior work? Were you aware of any earlier women photographers who were working like that from the early 20th century, from the 19th century? Still life painters, what do you think about?
Well, thank you for that question. I think that my thought is that the 70s are the new 30s, that things go in kind of bunches. And I was very influenced by by photography I came to know through the exhibit, The Bitter Years. And there were photographs of interiors that established the poverty, for instance, of the people in some of the photographs of the Dust Bowl, the people most affected by the Great Depression in this country. So I don't think I came to them with a blank slate, but no, I really didn't know comparable work by women. So my influences, one, I guess I wanted to mention, I'm maybe of all of us, I don't have an MFA from a program. I didn't study photography possibly in the same way that our group in general has. But I took classes in photography at San Francisco State, and I found John Collier Jr. And John Collier Jr. is considered the father today of visual anthropology. So an approach that of using photographs instead of as a projective technique, instead of asking questions, you know, who's the leader in your community, looking at for it instead with a camera. That and the conscientious approach that Susan mentioned of understanding the power of being the person with the camera and the disequilibrium. John Collier was deaf, and you can't say that you picked up his great vocabulary or anything like that, but he had a tremendous gift as a teacher and understanding of what a camera did in a interpersonal interaction. So those were, I think, my most formative, the most formative mentor. And I too didn't have women teachers, so that was I think my greatest disadvantage was not getting grants. I never got any grants, and I really felt that there was a structure out there of most of the grants being administered through or judged by people who honored their own students, and so, or students of their colleagues. So since I didn't have that, and John Collier wasn't a powerhouse in that same sense, as I struggled as a single mom and all, I really felt under-supported in that way. But I also have never gone to conferences and presented my work as a portfolio. I can't even say exactly how. I think I went to curators, and that was how I occasionally found it, you know, as a way to go in. I hope I answered your question, Joan.
Yeah, no, interesting.
Thank you for the question.
It is interesting that we're all talking about not having female mentors.
Well, eventually I did with Miriam Shapiro and feminist mentors in the late 70s, and then it began to change. But no, we didn't. Yeah, I think we just didn't.
Thank you for that question, Joan, and for that really interesting, that gave us a lot to think about, Joanne, especially in terms of mentorship, but also the very real structures that existed to provide financial support, and also just the connections. It was a very small field, and if you sort of fell outside a certain network, often it was difficult. Joanne, who is your question for?
Well, my question is for Susan, but I just want to add for Joan that Nathan did accept my work into vision and expression. So that was another significant thing in my career. Susan, I was actually wondering if you had encountered John Collier, since you have had your periods in New Mexico, because he was close. He grew up among Native Americans on a Navajo reservation. His father was the head of the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and he has a great connection to New Mexico. So I wondered if you had encountered him.
No, I never really did meet him, although I was I had great admiration for him and wish I had. But it's interesting that you bring up visual anthropology, because that was where I really began. The way I got to go to Canada was an anthropologist who was an ethnographic filmmaker, Asen Balixi. I met him in Boston right after I got out of college. I went to Boston and lived there for a year and freelanced as a photographer, and showed him my work. And he said, how would you like to go to Canada and live on an Indian reserve? Now, this guy, Asen Balixi, he's well known for a series of films that he had made on the Nitsilic Eskimo. And that work was very classical and traditional, almost like Robert Flaherty's work. And so, that's why that book, Through Navajo Eyes, was so important to me, that Jessica asked me about the other day, because that was, the idea of, well, what would happen if you gave the subject the camera rather than you photographing the subject? And it just changes everything. Whose perspective is it from? Is it from the subject's perspective, the Native American perspective, or the photographer's perspective? And where is the photographer coming from? So those were all questions that I was very much dealing with. And at one point, I actually enrolled in a graduate program in anthropology at Temple University, because and then after one or two semesters, I decided, well, you know what? I could just be a photographer. I don't have to get a PhD in anthropology to do what I want to do. So that's how I got back out to New Mexico.
Perfect answer.
Yeah.
Thank you both. Susan, that leaves you as our last panelist to ask a question. Who's your question for?
Well, my question is for Bea Nettles. And, it was just really interesting that when I was a professor at Purdue, I would escape from Purdue by driving to Champaign, Urbana, and bringing graduate students, and Bea and I would have group critiques together with our students. That was like the big city, but Bea was also in the Midwest, kind of in the hinterlands. So my question for you is, now that you've had this, that you are having this retrospective and book, which I want to congratulate you on, it just is so wonderful. I'm wondering, how do you feel about that? Did it come at the right time, do you think? Would you have liked to have had a book in retrospective a little earlier? And where do you think it will lead you in the future?
That's a great question. I would have perhaps liked it a little earlier, certainly before COVID, if the whole thing had happened, because it was planned for a couple of years before we knew anything about this. And then it started, and it had its full run in St. Louis. And then it opened in Rochester, and I went to the opening. That would have been in February. And 200 people came. I had students come from Brazil. It was amazing. And, it was a wonderful mob scene opening, and so many people I really wanted to spend more time with. But I expected to go back in May. And then, of course, COVID hit. The whole thing got shut. It stayed there in the dark. Came to eventually to Illinois, which again, that's where I teach. It was supposed to be a big reunion in the fall. That was, to me, one of the main things I was looking forward to, was reuniting with former colleagues and students in particular, and they couldn't do it. We had an online opening. It was open for about a month, and again, it got closed down and then reopened to people with masks, 10 at a time or whatever. And then the Eastman did reopen it to, again, there were certain stringent rules. There was no opening. There was nothing actual. The only real openings were the St. Louis one. And as the show picked up steam, the one in Rochester, which I'm really grateful for. I'm not sure I got to the gist of the question, but what next? I am hoping in April that we can have a reunion of some sort in Illinois. I've been selected for an Outstanding Art Alumni Award, which was supposed to happen last year in September, but it's going to happen in April of this coming year. And we're really hoping to have a reunion. And then I don't know what'll happen. after that. I do feel weird about travel. I think a lot of people have started to travel a little bit again and kind of know what that feels like. So I'm not sure how much more of that I'll be doing. But I am really grateful, and that the book will be around for a good long time. It's large and heavy, for one thing.
That was a really good question, because I think that does get to the heart of the matter, which is about these sort of mixed feelings about the sort of trajectory of each of your careers, and how it must feel in some cases to have all of this attention at this moment. And I want to thank all of you for posing those questions to one another. My favorite part of these kinds of panel discussions, no matter how much preparation I do, I tend to really enjoy, I think the best questions often come from each other, from you to one another. So thank you for that very much. Well, I would like to truly thank each of you for the thoughtful and informative conversation we've had today. I know I've learned a great deal from this discussion, and certainly from the longer conversations I've had with each one of you, which again, I encourage all of our viewers to watch. Most of all, I'm really thrilled that each of you is now represented in some depth at the Ransom Center. And here your work is available to the public for viewing and research. So the goal here is that it will become part of any new histories that are told through our collection. And I'm really thrilled to make that possible. I'm just really glad that all of you are now represented here in this institution. Thank you so much, all of you.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
everyone.
We're thrilled too.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
thanks, Jessica.
Thank
And
you.
and
Thank you,
thanks
and-
to everybody. Well, this was, for me, this was wonderful to see everybody, and I hate to say goodbye.